Hey everyone, this story begins at the edge of a life that was supposed to disappear quietly. Before the world knew her name, before the numbers, before the victory, there was a single night that changed everything. If stories of survival, silent revenge, and unstoppable rise speak to you, take a moment to like and subscribe, because what follows is not just a story, it is a reckoning. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where broken beginnings never get the final word. At 16, her life collapsed without warning. One day she existed inside a house that barely tolerated her presence, and the next she stood outside it with nothing but a backpack, borrowed shoes, and a future that looked smaller than the street behind her. There was no safety net waiting beyond that door. No emergency plan. No hidden support. The people who were meant to protect her decided she was no longer worth the trouble, and the world did not pause to question it. She did not cry immediately. Shock wrapped itself around her instincts and forced her to keep moving. The night air felt heavier than it should have, pressing against her chest as if reminding her that childhood had ended without permission. Hunger arrived before fear. Cold followed closely behind. Pride came last, whispering that whatever happened next would be handled alone. The first weeks blurred together in survival mode. Couches became temporary lifelines. Libraries turned into shelters where time passed quietly and safely. School remained a place she attended not because it felt normal, but because it gave her structure when everything else had fallen apart. Every day required calculations about food, transportation, and how invisible she could make herself to avoid uncomfortable questions. What stayed with her most was not the lack of money, but the sudden understanding that love could be conditional. That lesson carved itself into her bones. She learned quickly that being underestimated was a form of freedom. Nobody expected anything from a broke teenager with no family backing. That low expectation became her hiding place. She watched others closely, absorbing lessons without being taught. She noticed how money moved. How confidence opened doors. How silence sometimes carried more power than confrontation. While others her age worried about weekend plans, she worried about winter and what it would take to survive it. Every small win mattered. Every mistake felt expensive. The system did not bend easily for her. Forms asked for parental signatures she did not have. Opportunities assumed support she was denied. Yet each rejection sharpened her focus. She began to understand that her life would not be handed back to her gently. It would have to be taken piece by piece with patience and strategy. She worked wherever she could, doing jobs that paid little but taught a lot. Cleaning, sorting, assisting, lifting, learning. She listened more than she spoke. Observed more than she reacted. Inside, something fierce was growing. Not anger but clarity. A promise to herself that this beginning would never define the ending. There were nights when exhaustion tried to convince her to give up. When loneliness echoed louder than hunger. In those moments she imagined a future version of herself looking back, measuring whether this pain had been worth enduring. That image became her anchor. She refused to let her story end where others expected it to. By the time she turned 18, she had already lived several lives. She understood bills, boundaries, and resilience in ways that could not be taught in classrooms. She was still broke, still unsupported, but no longer lost. Direction replaced despair. Purpose replaced panic. What no one saw was the blueprint forming quietly in her mind. He was not dreaming vaguely. She was planning precisely. Education would be leverage. Skills would be currency. Time would be her ally if she respected it. The people who had dismissed her presence would one day hear her name and struggle to place it. As the first chapter of her life closed, she stood at the edge of adulthood with scars instead of savings, but with something far more valuable. She had unbreakable self-trust. The world had already done its worst and she was still standing. That realization marked the true beginning of her rise, setting the stage for choices that would change everything in the chapters ahead. The journey forward would demand more sacrifice, more discipline, and more silence than she could yet imagine, but the foundation had been laid. From the ashes of being kicked out broke at 16, a queen was quietly preparing to build a life no one had ever expected, and the next chapter would be where the transformation truly began. The years that followed did not arrive with miracles or sudden rescues. They arrived with pressure. Relentless, shaping, unforgiving pressure that either breaks a person or turns them into something unrecognizable from who they once were. She chose the second path not because it was easier but because it was the only one that made sense. Adulthood met her without apology. Rent demanded consistency. Food demanded planning. Time demanded discipline. She learned to treat her days like currency, spending each hour intentionally. While others chased comfort, she chased stability. While others sought validation, she built capability. Every step forward was deliberate, even when it looked small from the outside. Education became a tool rather than a dream. She selected paths that offered leverage, not prestige. Certifications, skills, and experiences stacked quietly behind her name. She worked during the day and studied at night, not because she loved the grind but because she understood the cost of not grinding. Rest became strategic. Sleep became negotiated. Focus became sacred. She encountered setbacks that would have sent a softer spirit back to familiar dysfunction. Jobs ended suddenly. Promises dissolved. Opportunities slipped away at the last second. Each time she adapted. Each time she refined her approach. Failure stopped feeling personal and started feeling instructional. What separated her from others was not talent but endurance. She stayed when things became boring. She remained consistent when results lagged behind effort. She invested in herself when no one else saw the point. Slowly, almost invisibly, her circumstances began to shift. Her income stabilized, then increased. Her environment improved, then transformed. She moved from survival spaces into places that reflected her discipline. Clean lines. Quiet mornings. Controlled chaos. Every upgrade was earned, not gifted, and that knowledge made it sweeter. She did not announce her progress. She let distance do the talking. The people who once had access to her struggles lost sight of her entirely. Silence protected her growth. Privacy preserved her momentum. She learned that success spoken too early attracts unnecessary interference. Internally, she confronted wounds that money could not heal. Abandonment had left marks that required intention to overcome. She invested in understanding herself, breaking patterns, and choosing differently. Healing became another form of discipline. She refused to build a successful life on a broken foundation. By her mid-20s, she was no longer just surviving. She was building. Assets replaced liabilities. Vision replaced reaction. She studied ownership, investment, and long-term planning with the same hunger she once reserved for survival. The idea of security expanded into the idea of legacy. Opportunities multiplied because preparation met timing. She recognized doors others overlooked. She negotiated without desperation. She walked away when alignment was missing. Confidence settled into her presence, not loud or boastful but undeniable. The memory of being kicked out at 16 never left her. It evolved into fuel. Not revenge driven by bitterness, but revenge defined by excellence. Every milestone reached quietly contradicted the narrative written for her. Every achievement rewrote expectations she never agreed to. As her net worth climbed, so did her discernment. She chose peace over proximity. Growth over familiarity. Purpose over approval. The life she was building no longer had room for people who only remembered her at her lowest. By the time the numbers approached heights once unimaginable, she had already won internally. The external success simply confirmed what she had known for years. She was never meant to disappear. She was meant to dominate quietly, then unmistakably. This chapter closed with her standing inside a life valued at $850,000, not just in assets but in self-respect, resilience, and control. The world that once dismissed her would soon take notice, and the reckoning waiting ahead would test just how strong her crown had become. By the time her life crossed the threshold others would label as success, she had already learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Silence could be louder than proof. The world had not been invited to watch her rise. There were no announcements, no celebrations broadcast for approval. Her growth happened behind closed doors, in spreadsheets, contracts, early mornings, and late nights that never made it into anyone else's memory. What changed first was her relationship with power. As a teenager, power had belonged to those who could discard her without consequence. As a young adult, power had shifted into her hands through independence. Now power lived in choice. The choice to engage or ignore. The choice to remember or move on. The choice to decide who had access to her presence and who would never touch her peace again. Her life no longer revolved around survival. It revolved around optimization. She audited her habits the same way she audited her finances. Anything that drained her energy without return was removed. She refined her routines, protected her mornings, and treated her mental space as an asset. Stress was no longer tolerated as normal. Chaos was no longer romanticized as growth. As her assets grew, so did curiosity from the outside. People who had not checked on her for years suddenly became aware of her existence again. Her name surfaced in conversations she was not present for. Success has a way of echoing backward, reaching ears that once ignored cries for help. She noticed, but she did not react. The memory of being 16 and disposable remained clear. Not as a wound but as a reference point. It reminded her that validation from the same hands that once pushed her away was unnecessary. She had already validated herself through consistency, discipline, and outcomes no one could deny. Her environment reflected her evolution. The space she lived in was no longer temporary or borrowed. It was intentional. Every corner spoke of permanence. Not luxury for show but stability earned. The kind of stability that allows a person to exhale fully, knowing nothing is about to be taken away unexpectedly. With financial security came emotional clarity. She stopped confusing familiarity with loyalty. She stopped explaining her boundaries. She stopped shrinking her accomplishments to make others comfortable. There was no arrogance in her posture, only certainty. Certainty that her life belonged to her now. She began to understand that revenge did not require confrontation. It required contrast. The difference between who she was forced to be and who she chose to become was enough. Her existence itself contradicted every assumption made about her future. Opportunities continued to expand not because she chased them, but because she had become someone prepared to receive them. She moved into ownership, investments, and strategic partnerships that multiplied her efforts rather than consuming them. Money became a tool instead of a source of anxiety. She used it to buy time, freedom, and peace. Still, the past had not finished circling back. The distance she had created was starting to close, not by her choice but by the gravity of success. Those who once held power over her narrative were beginning to feel its absence. Silence from someone you once controlled can be unsettling. Prosperity from someone you dismissed can feel threatening. She sensed the shift before it fully arrived. The subtle changes. The indirect inquiries. The resurfacing of names that had not mattered in years. She did not prepare speeches or explanations. She prepared boundaries. Her life was no longer open for reinterpretation. Internally, she reflected on the journey with precision. Every hard lesson had shaped her decision-making. Every lonely season had strengthened her independence. Every closed door had redirected her toward something better. She understood now that being kicked out had not been a curse. It had been a brutal form of freedom. The $850,000 life she built was not a finish line. It was proof of concept. Proof that she could start with nothing and end with control. Proof that abandonment could not erase destiny. Proof that discipline could outlast rejection. As this chapter drew to a close, she stood fully in her power, aware that the next phase would test her resolve in a different way. The people who once decided her worth were about to remember her existence. And this time she would not be asking for entry, approval, or explanation. The stage was set for confrontation without words, for reckoning without conflict. The next chapter would not be about building anymore. It would be about watching reactions unfold as the past came face to face with a future it never expected to see her living. The moment arrived quietly, the way most defining moments do. There was no dramatic announcement, no warning sign, no emotional build-up visible to the outside world. It came disguised as curiosity, masked as concern, wrapped in familiarity that felt almost polite. The past, long silent, had finally decided to remember her. By now, her life moved with rhythm and intention. Days were structured. Goals were clear. There was no chaos left to exploit. So when traces of her former world began circling closer, she noticed immediately. Not with fear, not with excitement, but with awareness. Awareness sharpened by years of protecting herself from disappointment. People who had once watched her leave without hesitation were now aware of what she had built. News travels differently when success is involved. Achievements have a way of resurfacing old connections, especially when those connections believe they still hold emotional access. What they did not understand was that the girl they once dismissed no longer existed. She did not rush to respond. Time had taught her the value of observation. She watched patterns repeat themselves from a distance. The same entitlement, the same assumptions, the same belief that shared history guaranteed present relevance. The difference now was power. Power was no longer something they controlled. She reflected deeply during this period. Not out of confusion but out of responsibility to herself. Healing did not mean forgetting. Growth did not require reconnection. Closure did not demand conversation. She had already closed the chapter where she needed approval from those who failed her. Emotionally, she remained steady. Financial independence had given her something priceless: the ability to choose without pressure. She did not need to impress. He did not need to prove. She did not need to rescue anyone from their own regrets. Her success was not a bridge back to the past. It was a wall that defined where access ended. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same people who once saw her as a burden now saw her as an opportunity. The same voices that questioned her worth now spoke with interest. But interest without accountability held no value. Familiarity without responsibility meant nothing. She noticed how narratives tried to shift. How memory softened when outcomes improved. How absence of support was rewritten as misunderstanding. She did not correct the record. Truth does not require defense when reality is visible. Her life was evidence enough. What surprised her most was not their return but her own response. There was no anger left to activate. No need for confrontation. No hunger for apology. She had outgrown the emotional weight of their validation. Growth had replaced grievance. Instead of reacting, she leaned further into her future. She expanded her investments, strengthened her long-term plans, reinforced the systems that protected her peace. She refused to allow distraction at the height of her clarity. Her life had been too hard-won to be destabilized by nostalgia. Boundaries became non-negotiable. Not spoken loudly but enforced quietly. Access was limited. Information was controlled. Emotional distance was maintained. She did not owe explanations for a life built without help. She did not owe space to those who abandoned her when she needed it most. She recognized that this moment was the true test of her evolution. Success alone does not complete transformation. The ability to remain aligned when the past resurfaces is what proves growth. She passed that test without hesitation. There was power in her restraint. Power in choosing silence over satisfaction. Power in letting others sit with the consequences of their choices without offering relief. She had learned that sometimes the most effective response is simply living well and refusing to be pulled backward. Her peace became louder than any argument she could have made. Her stability became the answer to every unspoken question. The life she built spoke fluently without saying a word. As she moved forward, she felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not for the pain itself but for the strength it forced her to develop. If she had been protected, she might never have discovered her own capacity. If she had been supported, she might never have learned independence. If she had been loved correctly, she might never have learned self-trust. This chapter closed with her fully aware that the final phase of her journey was approaching. Not a phase of struggle but of reckoning. The people who once decided she was disposable were now witnessing the full consequence of that decision. And the final chapter would not be about confrontation or reconciliation. It would be about legacy. The next chapter would reveal what happens when a Black Queen no longer needs revenge, because her existence has already delivered justice. The final chapter of her story did not arrive with noise. It arrived with certainty. The kind that settles deep into the body when nothing is left to prove and no one is left to impress. She had crossed beyond reaction, beyond validation, beyond the need to be understood by people who never tried to understand her in the first place. Her life now operated from a place of intention and ownership. Every decision reflected long vision rather than short emotion. She moved through her days with calm authority, not rushed, not hesitant, not reactive. The chaos that once defined her teenage years had been replaced by structure, clarity, and control. The $850,000 life she built stood as a quiet monument to resilience. Not flashy. Not exaggerated. Real equity. Real security. Real freedom. The kind of life that allows a person to choose peace every single day. The kind of life that cannot be shaken by old voices or rewritten histories. She no longer wondered what might have happened if she had been supported. That question lost relevance when she realized she had become self-made in the truest sense. Every skill acquired. Every dollar earned. Every boundary enforced. Nothing had been handed to her. Nothing had been rescued. She was the architect of her own stability. Those who once pushed her out had nothing to say now. Not because they lacked words but because the story no longer included them. Their opinions carried no weight in a narrative they did not help write. She did not block them out of bitterness. She simply outgrew the space where their voices mattered. The power of her journey lay not in confrontation but in contrast. A 16-year-old once deemed disposable had grown into a woman who owned her future completely. The same world that expected her to disappear now had to acknowledge her permanence. She used her success with discernment. She invested wisely. She gave intentionally. She supported causes that aligned with her values, not her guilt. She understood the difference between generosity and self-betrayal. Her boundaries protected her ability to remain kind without being exploited. Legacy became her focus. Not just financial but emotional and cultural. She understood that her story would inspire others who felt invisible, discarded, or underestimated. She became living proof that being kicked out does not mean being counted out. That abandonment can ignite ambition rather than destroy it. She carried herself differently now. Not hardened but unshakable. The softness she protected was chosen, not forced. The strength she embodied was earned, not assumed. She was no longer surviving in a world that doubted her. She was thriving in one that finally recognized her presence. Looking back, she did not romanticize the pain. She honored it. Every cold night, every unanswered call, every moment of fear had built the foundation of her discipline. Without it, she might not have developed the precision that carried her forward. Without it, she might not have learned to trust herself above all else. Her story ended where it began, but from the opposite perspective. Once standing outside a door with nowhere to go, she now stood inside a life that no one could take from her. Once dependent on others for survival, she now provided her own security. Once dismissed, she was now undeniable. This was not a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real. It was earned. It was permanent. And as her journey closed, one truth stood unchallenged above all others. Being kicked out broke her circumstances, but it built her character. Being abandoned at 16 did not destroy her future. It defined her power. She did not rise to prove anyone wrong. She rose because she refused to disappear. And that is the quiet, unstoppable legacy of a Black queen who built a life they never expected.